I'm
That's
here.
right.
Excellent. All right. So, excellent talk by Dr. Lai and Dr. Deisinger. And so, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jim Loomis. He's a medical director at Bernard Medical Center. And I am just going to turn it over to you, my friend. Everyone's popping over from the other room, so load up your presentation
All right. Let me
and roll.
make sure I have this here. Let me click here. Whoops. So hold on. Let me share my screen. Oh, wait. Hold on. That's share screen down here. All right. There we go. All right. Can you see me there?
Yes, I can, my friend. I'll see you in a little bit.
All right. Thank you. So, first of all, thanks for inviting me to speak today. What I wanted to talk about today was the role of diet and exercise in maintaining endothelial function, really in the context of peripheral vascular disease. So, first of all, let's I'm sure many of you already know peripheral vascular disease comes from atherosclerosis or blockage in the arteries to the lower extremity, and fairly common. It's estimated that by the time you're 80, men have about a 25% chance of having peripheral artery disease, and that incidence increases with age. Peripheral artery disease can present several different ways. About 50%, 20 to 50% of the time, people present asymptomatically, and it's picked up on physical examination, lack of pedal pulses, such as that. About 40 to 50% have atypical leg pain. 10 to 35% have classic claudication. Claudication, as you know, is cramping or in the calf muscle classically with exertion, which goes away with rest. And about 1 to 2% present with a threatened limb. For those patients that are asymptomatic on presentation, about 5 to 10% will develop symptoms over 5 years, and 1 to 2% will develop critical leg ischemia, much more common in patients who have diabetes. For patients who present with intermittent claudication, about 15% over the course of the next 5 years their claudication will worsen. 7% require bypass surgery. 4% go on to major amputations. But most importantly, 20% of people who present with intermittent claudication will have a non-fatal cardiovascular event, either MI or stroke, in that 5 period. And the 5-year mortality increases to almost 30%, of which most of those were cardiovascular deaths. So oftentimes peripheral vascular disease is not the peripheral vascular disease itself that's the issue. It's the fact that atherosclerosis, which causes the peripheral vascular disease, isn't isolated to the lower extremity. Obviously, also involves our coronary arteries and carotid arteries. So, as you probably know, peripheral vascular disease is typically diagnosed or confirmed with what's called the ABI, which is a ratio of the ankle to arm pressure. You can see on the upper right how those are interpreted. There's several classification systems around peripheral vascular disease, and as you can see, it ranges from asymptomatic all the way to ulceration or gangrene, which is a critical event. Lots of different ways to treat peripheral vascular disease. We're going to focus on the ones on the left, the lifestyle-related diseases. Also important is risk factor control. Smoking cessation, by the way, is by far the most important thing that patients can do to both prevent and prevent the progression of peripheral vascular disease. Risk factor control is also important. Again, those are really lifestyle-related issues, which we'll talk about in a minute. There are certain medications which have been shown to help. In more severe cases, stents, and then sometimes requiring bypass surgery. So if you step back, though, and you think about these risk factors, they're really the same as for coronary disease and stroke. So smoking. And what's interesting is things like smoking and diabetes and actually have a greater impact on the risk for peripheral vascular disease than they do of CAD and stroke. LDL, it's more important for coronary artery disease, hypertension, it's about the same. The microvascular disease, oftentimes associated with poorly controlled diabetes, is again imparts a greater risk for peripheral vascular disease. But if you look at this list, what's interesting is every single one of these conditions actually affects our endothelial function, and really at the core is in fact endothelial dysfunction. So what is the endothelium? The endothelium is a single cell lining layer of cells that line both our blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, and their function is to kind of the yin and yang of thrombosis and antithrombotic and anticoagulant versus thrombotic, and that controls vasoconstriction and dilatation so that the blood vessels appropriately constrict and dilate in response to increased oxygen demand. The normal endothelium has a vasodilatory phenotype, exhibits high levels of PGI1, prostaglandin, and nitric oxide, and low levels of reactive oxidative oxygen species, which is oxidative stress, also lower levels of uric acid. All of that predisposes to enhance the vasodilatation of the blood vessels when necessary. There's also an anticoagulant phenotype. We see low levels of von Willebrand factor and plasminogen activator inhibitor and P-selectin, all of which are prothrombotic agents that we make. And also there's typically low levels of inflammation, and that's reflected in low levels of CRP and TNF and interleukin-6. The top two, the vascular adhesion models, are important because what happens is when we develop low-grade inflammation, when we develop inflammation in the endothelial lining, these adhesion molecules are expressed, and they're the ones that actually the monocytes bind to enter the subendothelium, which is fundamental in the role of developing atherosclerotic plaque. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We also see high populations of endothelial progenitor cells in the circulation, and those are cells that can help repair the endothelium when they get damaged. And we also see low levels of endothelial microparticles, which are indicative of endothelial stress and damage. So at the top, normally when we have an intact blood vessel, there's laminar flow. The endothelium can mediate vasodilatation when necessary. So we maintain a normal ABI. There's a match. We maintain the match between oxygen supply and demand, and because of that, there's not a lot of oxidative stress associated with that. However, when we start to develop peripheral vascular disease and stenosis, that creates turbulence across the stenosis, and because there's pressure drop across that stenosis, the impaired endothelium can't appropriately dilate. So we get a reduced ABI. There's a mismatch in the O2 supply and demand, which creates high oxidative stress, which, as you'll see in a minute, really just perpetuates. It becomes self-perpetuating because that oxidative stress in and of itself can further damage the endothelium. So when we see endothelial dysfunction, it's the opposite phenotype, if you will, of a normal endothelium. So impaired vasodilatation, so more of a shift toward vasoconstriction. There's a procoagulant phenotype, which predisposes to thrombosis. There's a pro-inflammatory phenotype, which can cause progression of the peripheral vascular disease. And also, there's a decreased vascular repair capacity to repair the damaged endothelium, which is obviously important. So again, this kind of shows what happens. Number one, and then on the far left, you get endothelial dysfunction. That causes increased expression of these VCAM and ICAM receptors. That's what binds the monocytes. You also get oxidation because of the excess oxidative stress, you get oxidation of the LDL particles, so the peroxidation of LDL, especially the small dense LDLs, they can migrate through the subendothelium into the subendothelium, and that's what attracts the monocytes, which consume those. That creates a foam cell, and over time, again, this kind of self-perpetuates as the plaque grows, and eventually the plaque can rupture, and you get a blood clot. And in the heart, that's MI. That's what causes an MI, obviously. So again, over time, what happens is we start to accumulate this plaque underneath the subendothelium. The plaque matures, and typically, unfortunately, we're starting to see these fatty streaks and early signs of endothelial dysfunction, early atherosclerosis, even now in teenagers, which is really, really tragic. So endothelial dysfunction is associated with a wide variety of problems, including chronic kidney disease. It's associated with increased risk for cancer, probably because of angiogenesis, heart attack, stroke, high blood pressure, and again, obviously peripheral vascular disease. And again, it's when we start to get this chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, endothelial dysfunction. It also is one of the things that triggers some of the complications, for example, type 2 diabetes, retinopathy, vascular neuropathy, kidney disease, stroke, etc. So what are some of the specific dietary contributions to the development of endothelial dysfunction? Well, we know that increased intake of saturated fat, and particularly trans fats, markedly increases the risk. Excess salt consumption, refined sugars, and then the lack of fruits and vegetables, because again, our bodies have a fairly limited ability to mitigate oxidative stress, and any extra antioxidant capacity we gain has to come from our diet. And the only place we find dietary antioxidants is in plants, because the antioxidants are actually the plant's natural mechanism to protect itself against when they get damaged, and fungal infections and things like that. And in general, the more color of food has, the more antioxidant capacity it has. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in minutes. This was an interesting study published on the left. This is the impact of eating vegetables. At the top are things like the VCAM expression. At the bottom are signs of inflammation, as you can see. The consumption of vegetables is associated with a lower expression of the VCAM and the ICAM receptors, as well as a markedly lower risk expression of these of things like CRP and TNF1 and interleukins. On the right is compared to high-fat dairy products, and as you can see, it's the opposite. So this is felt to be one of the mechanisms around how fruits and vegetables are protective, and how come high-fat diets, particularly meat and dairy, and the saturated fat that comes with that, are associated with increased risk for endothelial dysfunction. We also know that a sedentary lifestyle causes a lot of issues, including endothelial dysfunction, which can create arterial stiffness, increased risk for atherosclerosis. We also know that stress in and of itself, so the stress hormones we secrete, and when in the stressful world downregulate nitric oxide, and we're going to talk a lot more about nitric oxide here in a minute, because that's really one of the prime mediators of endothelial function. So stress in and of itself, as does sleep deprivation. Chronic sleep deprivation increases oxidative stress, can create inflammation. There's some autonomic dysregulation, again, all of which contribute to endothelial dysfunction. So as you can see, endothelial dysfunction in many ways is a lifestyle-related disease. So I want to shift gears for a minute and talk for a minute about how we got from here to here. Because I think, as I've learned more and more about the fundamental importance about lifestyle medicine, I've come to realize I really do think we make healthy living way too complicated. Because if you think about human physiology, human behavior, human nutritional needs, kind of through the lens, human stress response, our sleep needs, through the lens of our evolutionary biology, and ask the simple question, what did all of those things evolve to do? Well, like any living creature, they all evolved to facilitate us living long enough to find a mate and pass on our DNA. And for most of human history, there was two primary tasks that we had to perform for that to occur. We had to be able to find food when we're starving, and then try not to be someone else's food when they're starving. That was the origin of most of our stress. And we had to respond to that stress but by being physically active, because we had to gather and hunt our food or run away from fight the leopards. So again, we evolved to be physically active. You look at our anatomy and physiology, the biomechanics of our knees and ankles, the physiology of our heart and lungs, our nutrition and metabolism, and even our stress response. We have adrenaline, primarily designed to get us ready to perform activity, and then we have cortisol, which helps us recover. And assuming we survived, that's when we'd rest, recover, and refuel. And we refueled with whatever we could find around us on a given day. And although there's no such thing as a paleo diet, there were certainly ancestral dietary patterns. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but our ancestors, despite what we may perceive, were not hunter-gatherers, we were gather-hunters. And the repetitive stress associated with activity and then rest and recovery is how we built resilience. For any of you out there that have ever trained for a 5K or a 10K or a marathon, or you lifted weight, that's how you accomplish those goals. That's how we become stronger, faster. We can go further as we build resilience through this cycle of repetitive stress, activity, and recovery. Well, now let's fast forward to the modern world. We don't have to do any of that anymore. We no longer have the energy to get energy. We've got Uber Eats and Instacart and grocery stores and restaurants. The kinds of energy and nutrients we consume oftentimes bear little to no resemblance to what we're really supposed to be eating. We eat too much meat and dairy and processed foods. We don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. We're no longer running and fighting physically. We're doing that emotionally. And we're not worried about starving to eat my leopards. We worry about jobs and money and health and family and relationships and COVID and, here in Washington, D.C., politics and traffic and weather and on and on and on. And then we compound the whole process by not adequately resting and recovering. We drink too much caffeine. We drink too much alcohol. We smoke cigarettes. We don't get enough sleep. Our sleep's not restful. So as opposed to resilience, we end up exhausted. And if you kind of flip the script upside down, that, in fact, it's this evolutionarily mismatched lifestyle, with 90% plus of the cause of 90% plus of the chronic problems that I see every day in my practice as a primary care physician. Heart disease, peripheral vascular disease, stroke, diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome, prediabetes, insulin resistant, COPD, even many cancers, breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer. And I would even take it so far as to say even things like autoimmune disease and depression and anxiety. All of these things are associated with this mismatched lifestyle we're designed to lead. Yet, we're going to spend close to $4 trillion in the United States this year taking care of the consequences of this mismatched lifestyle. And a couple of billion of that, by the way, are spent on things like stents and bypass surgery for people with peripheral vascular disease every year. So, what we've come to call healthcare is really not healthcare; it's sick care. And in fact, I would argue it's a giant game of whack-a-mole. What I learned in medical school. Patients come in and their blood pressure is high. We whack that down with some pills, and they come back 6 months later and their blood pressure is good, but now their cholesterol's high. So we whack that down with some pills, and up pops your sugars, and eventually we get around to whacking off body parts. Take out your prostate gland or your breast, or take out part of your. That is not health care. That is sick care. And in this sick care system that we have today, we certainly have the ability to add years to our patients' lives, but we are literally taking away life from their years. We're allowing patients to accumulate the disability that comes from things like peripheral vascular disease and cancer and disease and stroke, as opposed to a true healthcare system, which focuses on the root cause of these chronic conditions. In that system, we now have the ability to add years to our patients' life and sustain life from their years. And if you overlaid these two graphs and looked at kind of the difference, where people are when they're 60 or 70, I can guarantee you there's not enough drugs in the pharmacy to take someone who's sliding down that slope and take them back up to the healthy line. There's not enough drugs in the pharmacy, not enough procedures. It's really about leading a healthy lifestyle. So what does that mean? Well, it means we just need to replicate the lifestyle we evolved to lead. So what does that look like? Well, first of all, we need to limit our exposures to environmental toxins. And that primarily means limiting tobacco and alcohol. Remember that, the primary liquid or fluid we had available to us through human history wasn't whiskey and beer and wine. It was water. But I think there is increasing concern about the role that pesticides and herbicides and hormones and antibiotics and antibiotic residues and things like that play in our health. We have to achieve physical wellness. And we do that by moving around 30 to 60 minutes most days. In a couple days a week, we need to replicate picking stuff up and moving out of the way. And a quick comment about physical wellness. As human beings, as I mentioned earlier, we evolved to be physically active. But physical activity through most of human history wasn't a willful event. We didn't decide, hey, I think I'm going to go find some food today, or I think I'm going to fight that leopard. If we didn't do those things, we weren't around very long. And both fortunately, but in some ways unfortunately, in the modern world, because we no longer have to spend energy to get injured, we're running and fighting emotionally. Physical activity has devolved into what many people now exercise. And we've come to view it almost exercise as a discrete event. I'm going to put on special clothes. I'm going to go to a special place. I'm going to do a special thing. It's going to start and stop. We have a tendency to do that or not do anything, not recognizing that there's lots of ways to incorporate physical activity into your day-to-day routine, which may not involve exercise in the way we think about it. Going for a walk after dinner, or hike in the woods, or work in the garden, or take the stairs instead of the elevator and park on the far end of the parking lot. I mean, all of that counts. And it's even been shown that 5 to 10 minute blocks of activity that are accumulated through the day are just as effective as 30 minutes continuous. So, for example, 2 15-minute walks is just as effective as 30 minutes of continuous exercise. So the idea here is not discouraging exercise. It's leading a physically active lifestyle, whether it be exercise or not. Second of all, we need to be emotionally well, and that's about how we cope with stress and recover from stress through sleep. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, we need to be nutritionally well. And that means two things. We've got to eat what we're supposed to eat, but we also have to not eat what we're not supposed to eat. And again, we're going to talk more about that in a minute. The other thing I think we underappreciate is how connected these domains are. The fact that you can't truly be emotionally well without regular physical activity. And in fact, the more stress you have, the more activity you need. And the reason is, your brain can't tell there's something worried about COVID and seeing a leopard. So we get the same stress response. So what happens when we create a mismatch between how much we move and how much we stress? Well, now all of a sudden, all of that adrenaline starts to turn against us. We feel anxious, our heart palpitates, our blood pressure goes up. We can't sleep at night because our mind's racing around worrying about what happened today, what might happen tomorrow. The cortisol we make. So cortisol's job, one of its jobs is to help us heal after perform activity. That's one reason we give cortisone shots. But the other thing it does is it stimulates our appetite, preferentially stores what we eat as belly fat, because it's trying to help you refill that gas tank before you fight the next leopard. So again, when we create a mismatch between how much we move and how much we stress, it can lead to things like stress eating and weight gain, or make it hard to lose weight. There's a fundamental connection between diet and physical activity. If you use your car as an example, I would imagine there's no one in the audience who parks their car in the garage for a year, but and doesn't drive it, but still puts gas in it 5 times a day. Even if we're emptying our gas tanks, you don't put 30 gallons of gas in a 15-gallon gas tank. And probably most importantly, you wouldn't put diesel gas in your car, even in moderation, if it runs on regular lead in it. We take better care of our cars sometimes than we do of ourselves. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that the vast majority of that $4 trillion that we're going to spend on sick care in the United States is spent continuously repairing people's cars because they keep filling it up with the wrong kind of gas. So now I think most of us understand we need to move around and not stress out and get a good night's sleep. Operationalizing that can be difficult because we do live in a busy, stressful world, but it's certainly doable if we're going to make it a priority. The $1 million question, though, is the gas in the car question. What is the optimum diet for human health and performance? There's so much misinformation, disinformation, conflicting information, confusion around diet. And certainly, like many of you, I didn't learn anything about this in medical school. But if you really think about it, I would argue that we, once again, if you frame diet through our evolutionary heritage, that we really evolved to follow the same types of dietary patterns as our ancestors followed for literally hundreds of thousands of years. And again, as I may have mentioned earlier, our ancestors were not hunter-gatherers. We were in temperate climates. I'm not talking about the Inuits in the subarctic. our ancestors were gatherer hunters. It was much easier to get calories off the ground than it was to hunt down big animals. But what did we gather? Well, it was primarily unrefined plants. It was roots and stems and leaves, seeds and fruits and vegetables and legumes. That being said, there was no white flower tree. There wasn't a canola oil bush. There wasn't a Dr. Pepper nut. All of this highly processed sugar is processed grains, processed flour, white flour, artificial sweeteners, food dyes, food additives. All of those things are just like putting diesel gas in our car. All of which, by the way, are also associated with endothelial dysfunction. The only dairy product we had available was human milk, and there's several lines of evidence around that. First of all, we had to domesticate other mammals to even get access to their milk. So when did that happen? Well, about 7,000 to 8,000 ago, which may seem like a long time, but if you look at the whole expanse of human history, it's literally a blink of an eye. Second of all, if you think of what dairy is, dairy is a biologic fluid that evolved species specific to facilitate baby mammals turn into mammals big enough to find food on their own. And once that happens, you don't need your mother's milk anymore. And that's why you don't go to the grocery store and see human milk and cheese to bring home and consume. You'd find that kind of strange, I think. So the idea that we should be consuming another mammal's milk that evolved to facilitate a 70-pound cow into a 1,700-pound cow just doesn't make a lot of sense. And then lastly, we're all born with an enzyme called lactase in our intestine that helps us digest milk sugar. And that gene is actually designed to turn off when we're about 4 or 5 years old. And that's exactly what happens in about 75 to 80% of the world population today. People become lactose intolerant in childhood. And again, it's because we don't need our mother's milk anymore. But around the same time we domesticated other mammals in Northern Europe, there was a genetic mutation which caused lactase persistence in a population of people. And because that provided a transient survival advantage at the time, that was right at the end of the last ice age. So there was still glaciation in parts of Northern Europe. So there was less availability of plant-based protein. So around the time we domesticated other mammals, all of a sudden we had an additional source of protein, which again created a transient survival advantage in that population. So that gene got passed into the population. And so about 20 to 25% of the world population today, mainly of people of Northern European descent, have retained the ability to digest milk sugar. But that is not, I used to think that lactose intolerance was the problem, right? That's the norm. It's lactose tolerance, which is actually the problem. That's actually the genetic mutation. It's lactose intolerance, which is the default state. Now, there's no doubt that our ancestors ate some meat. We don't know for sure how much because we haven't found any Paleolithic food diaries, but best estimates are that we probably got about 75 to 80% of our calories from plants and about 20 to 25% of our calories from animals. But those animals were wild animals, not cows, pigs, chickens, and fish, which have really become another form of processed food because of how they're raised. Stuff with corn and antibiotics and hormones, none of which, by the way, fish aren't designed to eat corn and cows aren't designed to eat corn and chickens aren't designed to eat corn. But I think you could also argue that our ancestors had a survival advantage to having that concentrated animal fat and protein because they needed to get big and strong, get away from the leopard before they died of some infectious disease when they were 30. So they never really had to worry about the overconsumption of animal-based foods because, and its association with things like cancer and diabetes and heart attacks because they were already dead, right? And we've unmasked many of these chronic diseases, all of which are associated with both the overconsumption of animal-based foods and processed foods as we've extended human life expectancy. And if you step back, one step further back and start thinking about the implications of how we raise animals today on the environment, the impact on climate change and water use and land use, even though our ancestors ate meat historically, I think you can make a very strong argument that if you're not starved for calories, that at a minimum, a plant-forward diet, and probably more ideally when you start factoring environment, a whole food plant-based diet is the optimum diet for human health, planetary health, etc. So if you look at the characteristics of an ancestral diet, they really all are aligned with the lifestyle that's been shown to prevent endothelial dysfunction, to maintain normal endothelial function. So it's very low in fat, especially in saturated fat. So if you look at the natural macronutrient ratios of a whole food plant-based diet, it's about 75% unrefined, it's high carb, about 75% unrefined carbohydrates. It's about 15% protein and about 10% fat, something like that. So very low in fat. It was naturally very low in sodium and very high in potassium. And potassium, we think about bananas, which do have some potassium, about 400 milligrams per serving. But it's the green leafy vegetables and fruits and things like that, which have much higher levels of potassium. In fact, a cup of beet greens, the greens on the top of the beets, have about 1,300 milligrams per cup. Swiss chard has about 1,000 milligrams per cup. Sweet potatoes have about 1,000 milligrams a cup. And the ideal ratio of potassium to sodium in the diet is about 3-to-1 potassium to sodium. And that's been shown to drive down blood pressure. We talk a lot about limiting sodium, but it's probably more important to focus on the ratio of potassium to sodium. And we know, as I mentioned earlier, that high potassium diets high sodium diets can directly impair endothelial function. It was very high in antioxidants, which we've already kind of talked about, and it had a very low omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio. So a lot of the inflammation that comes from the standard Western diet comes from an elevated omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. It's felt that it's a little bit controversial, but it's felt the ideal ratio is about 3-to-1, probably somewhere in there. As you may know, omega-6 fatty acids are the precursors to pro-inflammatory prostaglandins. The omega-3s are precursors to anti-inflammatory compounds. Now, we need inflammation because we need to heal wounds and fight infections and such as that. In fact, we have an evolutionary preference for inflammation because it was important to be able to create inflammation to heal wounds, fight infections. And that's why the ratio is in favor of the omega-6. So it's 5-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3. However, standard Western diet, you'll see omega-6, omega-3 ratios 20, 30, 40, 50-to-1. And even an unhealthy, vegan diet, which we're going to talk about in a second, you can see ratios in the 20 to 30-to-1 range because of the processed foods and if you're eating a lot of oil. So I think it is important to understand that what I'm talking about isn't necessarily a vegan diet. There's a lot of conflation these days between the two as interest in plant-based eating has increased. Historically, veganism came from a place of compassion around not harming other creatures. And I think we all do have some cognitive dissonance around where our food really comes from. That boneless, skinless chicken breast in the meat counter doesn't come all wrapped up, bloodless, and plastic. There's a pretty horrific backstory to that. But it's a lifestyle that includes not harming other creatures. So don't eat them, don't wear them, don't use products tested on them. But as you well know, there's a lot of really unhealthy food that's vegan. You can get highly processed foods that are vegan. You can get vegan cupcakes, you can get vegan ice cream, you can get Oreos, you can get vegan donuts. So that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is vegan or veganish, and that it limits or eliminates animal foods, but also these highly processed foods and these highly processed edible oils. And a good example is like Beyond Burgers or Impossible Burgers. I mean, Impossible Burgers and Beyond Burgers play a role, especially as a transition food. They're certainly better for the cow and better for the environment. If you compare it directly to a hamburger, a little bit better for you, but certainly not a health food. Highly processed, 30% of the calories are from fat. It's primarily saturated fat from coconut oil, etc. So that's not necessarily what I'm talking about. Again, it's minimally processed plant-based or whole plant-based sources of food. So what are some foods that have been specifically studied for their impact on endothelial function? The most important ones are foods that activate nitric oxide, and two of those foods are beets and arugula. And what's been shown is when we consume foods that are high in nitric oxide, almost immediately that increases nitric oxide synthesis. That helps maintain endothelial function. In fact, it's been shown that in endurance athletes, you can increase performance by about 10% by loading with beets or beet juice. Because again, when we increase the ability to vasodilate our blood vessels, that increases blood flow to the muscles. And so it provides a performance advantage And over the long run, in patients who maybe aren't so active, it's been shown over time to markedly, for patients who have impaired endothelial function, it's been shown to help improve endothelial function. It's been shown to decrease arterial stiffness, which helps reduce blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. So what foods have a lot of nitric oxide? Well, the highest levels are found in things like arugula or rocket, beetroot, lettuce, celery, spinach. Also a fair amount in kale and legumes and eggplant and cabbage and carrots and broccoli. Some of the lower foods are garlic, mushrooms, and tomatoes. Now, that doesn't mean those foods aren't important, because there are other foods which have been shown to help specifically improve endothelial function. And it's mainly foods that have, again, it's these polyphenols, the flavonoids, the flavones, the anthocyanins, which are the pigments in things like legumes and the skin of legumes and in berries. So quercetin, for example, which we see in onions and the allicin vegetables, very potent antioxidant, helps improve endothelial function. The catechins that you see in things like green tea, red wine, grapes, cocoa, very important. And even the isoflavones like genestin, which you find in soy-containing foods, edamame, tempeh, tofu, etc., have all been shown to positively impact endothelial function. Now, you have to be just one comment about soy. Soy has many health benefits, but you do have to be careful about the source of the soy, how it's consumed. You want to consume soy as close to the ground as possible. So the whole soy preparations are things like edamame and tempeh. But things like tofu and soy milk are okay. So tofu, as you probably know, is just curdled soy milk. So you take soy milk and you curdle it, and you scrape the curds off, and you press it into a block, and that's soy milk. But you don't want to get any more refined than that. So things like textured vegetable protein, soy protein isolate, which you'll find oftentimes in soy-based protein powder, that can actually, especially in women, can actually increase. Unlike these healthy soy products, which have been shown to decrease the risk of things like breast cancer in women and prostate cancer in men. The more highly refined products can have adverse health consequences because they actually activate other estrogen receptors. These are phytoestrogens that soy has. There's two estrogen receptors, and the highly processed soy can activate both, which can, and as opposed to the less processed, which weakly binds to the estrogen receptor and blocks the effect of estrogen. The more highly processed soy can actually activate the other hormone receptor, estrogen receptor, which may increase your risk. So it is important to understand that what we're talking about here is soy, and it's as close to the ground as you can get it. We also know that exercise training is a fundamentally important part of both helping improve symptoms in patients that have ongoing peripheral vascular disease, but also and maintaining healthy endothelial function. So we know that regular physical activity decreases some of these pro-inflammatory compounds like CRP and TNF. It stimulates the production of these of the EPCs, the progenitor cells, which help repair injured epithelium. And exercise in and of itself can increase the amount of nitric oxide in blood. We've also already talked about how maintaining healthy sleep patterns, as well as maintaining coping with stress in a healthful way, have been shown to not cause. Those are two other things that we need to maintain healthy endothelial function. And for those of you who I'm sure this has been covered by some of the other excellent speakers this morning, So this is from the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. These are the pillars of lifestyle medicine. And guess what? When we apply these pillars to our lives and our patients' lives, not only are we helping maintain a healthy endothelium, we're helping prevent cancer and heart disease and obesity and type 2 diabetes, because every single one of these pillars can both positively and or negatively impact endothelial function. We've talked a lot about nutrition. We know that exercise, we know that tobacco in particular is very toxic to the endothelium. We know that high stress levels and not enough sleep. And now when I talked about emotional wellness, I throw healthy relationships in. That's one way that's been shown to help us manage to maintain a healthy emotional state. So my favorite farmer philosopher, Wendell Berry, once said, and I think this really sums up some of the problems that, the way we think about food today, that we are fed by a food industry which pays no attention to our health, and we're treated by a health industry which pays no attention to our food. Now, just as a personal aside, like many of you, I didn't learn any of this in medical school. And if you would have asked me 10, 12 years ago if I ate healthy, I just would have regurgitated the pyramid, the food pyramid, low-fat dairy, lean meat, fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and try not to eat too much ice cream because everything in moderation. But it turns out that moderation is not the key. And this really has to do with the way our brains make choices, because you have to remember that all of our behaviors around food evolved to facilitate us, not starving to death in a world of food scarcity. Our behaviors around food did not evolve to navigate the food environment we live in today, where we're surrounded by ultra-processed food that is cheap, convenient, and tastes really good. And so part of the disconnect there in my own personal life was, and I think for many patients was, our brains are pretty good at thinking about the trees, but we're not very good at seeing the forest. And what I mean by that is, Monday the nurses might bring cookies in the office, and Tuesday I might have a donut in the doctor's lounge, and Wednesday I might go out for a cheeseburger and a beer, and Thursday it's someone's birthday, and I have a little cake and ice cream. And then Friday rolls around, I'm thinking, wow, I ate really healthy this week. I only had cookies once. So again, I was pretty good at moderating the trees, but I really wasn't seeing the forest. And unfortunately, found out that you literally can't outrun a mediocre diet, because in 2010, I tore my meniscus playing with my dog. And I had to wait a few months to get surgery because I was really busy at work. And then after the surgery, I didn't really do rehab, and I started to gain weight. And ended up becoming a patient. I lived in St. Louis at the time, and I trained at WashU. And so, I all of a sudden, I actually went into AFib, to atrial fibrillation. And it turns out I had undiagnosed sleep apnea, which had been triggered by the weight gain. And finally went and saw my saw my internist. My cholesterol's through the roof. I got metabolic syndrome. My cholesterol's like 260. My LDL's 160. Triglycerides 300. My A1C's 5.7. Blood pressure's 135 over 85. So I kind of knew where all of this was headed, but I didn't know how to head it off. And my doctors are treating me just like I treated my patients at the time. I'm on, an antiarrhythmic. I'm on CPAP machine. I need to be on statins. And one day, literally, I was laying on the couch. I stumbled across the documentary Forks Over Knives about using food as medicine. And I thought, wow, food is medicine. You kind of hear that. What does that even mean? Looked up some of the primary research, read the China study, and I thought, wow, the evidence was just overwhelming. And I'd never learned anything about this in med school. So in the summer of 2011, I made a commitment to rehab my knee and transition to a plant-based diet. Well, within 5 months, 5 months, I lost maybe 50 pounds. My cholesterol dropped from 260 to 150. A1C went from 5.7, 5.8 to 5.3. My blood pressure went from 135 over 85 to 106 over 60. My sleep apnea went away. My allergies went away. My asthma went away. on and on, and I could start exercising again. And a few years ago, when I turned 60, I wanted to do something epic and decided to try to kill myself, fortunately unsuccessfully, and competed and finished the Lake Placid Ironman. Now, that's where I learned about beets, by the way, because I was using a ton of beets, and I think it truly made a difference. And I can tell you that, and for those of you who've seen the movie The Game Changers, which I had the honor to be involved with that project, every single athlete that movie said the same thing, that the ability to recover after working out was almost miraculous, phenomenal. And I certainly experienced that. And so, I'd been a pretty competitive marathon runner, and, I'd run a marathon. I couldn't walk for a week or two. Here at age 60, 40 something years later, I'm doing an Ironman. And through that whole process, I never got sore. I never got stiff. I never experienced any of that, those kind of post-exercise, because again, the same things that cause endothelial dysfunction, the oxidative stress and all that are some of the same things that cause delayed onset muscle soreness in endurance athletes. So by following a whole food plant-based diet and focusing on these highly antioxidant foods, I think is what helped me recover faster. And I hear that story over and over. So that's the end of my talk. And I think we have time for a few questions. Let me stop sharing my screen here.
Another awesome presentation, personal experience. I really appreciate it. Dr. Loomis, you were the team physician for the Rams and the Cardinals, correct?
That is correct.
Did you institute this type of lifestyle medicine in with the athletes as well?
That was actually before I was plant-based, actually. Okay. And what's interesting is, the misconceptions in that whole sports world around sports nutrition are profound, right? It was all about the protein and then carbs, right? So we would go. I would travel with the Rams, and we would go and we would have our pregame meal at the hotel, and it would be steak, chicken breast, and pasta, right? Because you got to get your protein. And it's crazy. Exactly. And as was pointed out in the Game Changers, Derek Morgan, who was with the Titans at the time, talked about how when he went plant-based, his ability to recover, he had inflammatory. I mean, he's right. The injury rate in the end is 100%, right? 100%. And when he got tested for inflammation after he'd gone plant-based, there was even after a game, no evidence of inflammation. And wow. And what was interesting was that his teammates who were making fun of him to start with, now all of a sudden they're kind of coming up to him in the locker because you're seeing him hitting the gym, hitting the weights the next day, recovering so much faster. Like, oh, so what is it you're doing again? That's amazing. And I tell you, I was at the LA premiere of Game Changers, and Chris Paul, who's an NBA player, future Hall of Famer, I'm sure, came up to me and we were talking, and he had recently gone plant-based after seeing Game Changers, actually. And he told me something pretty profound. He said that that he didn't want to tell any of his teammates or anyone else in the league, not because 10 years ago they would have made fun of him, not for that, because it felt like he gave him such a competitive advantage. He didn't want to share the secret, right? Isn't that's crazy, right?
Hey, listen, Chris Paul, 37 years old, still competing at an incredibly high level.
Right. That's exactly right.
And it's incredible when you think about it. I have a question, and we'll get to a few questions there as well. So when you transition from a non-plant-based, is there a transitionary period where you sort of take out, add in until you just added in so much plant-based nutrition that the other just kind of goes away? How does that?
Well, so I use different strategies. I personally went cold turkey. I just went plant-based, right? Now, some people find that hard. So another way to kind of navigate this is that if you think about the way we think about food. So if you're not one like I decided overnight I'm going to go plant-based, and then that was it. The other strategy is, if you think about our food choices, you can broadly divide them into two boxes, right? We have a healthy box and an unhealthy box. And we spend a lot of our mental willpower trying to keep our hand out of that box, right? And so one strategy I found helpful for some patients is to kind of take them stock of what's in the healthy box, what's in the unhealthy box, and each week take one thing out of the unhealthy box and substitute something healthier. So take something that's highly processed, ultra processed, something that's plant derived, and then pick something healthier. Pick the easy things first because you want to set yourself up to succeed. It might be 3 months, it might be 6 months. And by the way, this is not an all or nothing thing. I'm not trying to imply that you have to be on a plant-based diet to perform athletically, to be optimal, to be well. But especially patients with, say, insulin resistance or coronary artery disease, the closer you can get to that all-in piece, the better you're going to be.
For sure. So share about PCRM and how that can help a lot more podiatrists and healthcare providers learn more about lifestyle medicine. And that sort of folds into a little bit of Dr. Horsley's question as well, which talks about, getting more healthcare providers to moving them toward a, whole foods, plant-based diet, or just incorporating and understanding lifestyle medicine and how it can help their patients. So share a little bit about PCRM.
Yeah. So PCRM, Physician Committee Responsible Medicine, was founded by Dr. Neil Barnard in 1985. They do a lot of work both on advocacy for ethical use of animals in research and things like that, but also have done some of the seminal actual clinical research on the impact of plant-based diets on things like weight loss and cholesterol and especially around type 2 diabetes. They've also done some studies, looking at rheumatoid arthritis, some chronic autoimmune diseases. In 2016, Neil decided, wouldn't it be great to have a medical practice that translates all this great research we've done into patient care? And so we founded the Barnard Medical Center and opened in 2016. I actually moved here from St. Louis to take the role as the medical director here. And our practice is it's a evidence-based primary care practice, but heavy emphasis on lifestyle medicine, particularly plant-based diets. We have our own dietitian who's plant-based, on and on. So we do a lot of telehealth. We're licensed now. We have clinicians licensed in about 20 states. We do a lot of consultations. We can't be their primary care, but think of, you have a cardiologist for heart. Think about a doctor to manage your lifestyle transition, right? So that's what we do. As far as the broader question around helping other doctors, an amazing organization that if you're not familiar with, you need to go check out today is the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. I'm a past board member. I'm actually a fellow of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. I got recertified, so I'm board certified in internal medicine, and a couple of years ago, which was pretty tough because I haven't studied for boards in a long time, I got boarded or double boarded in lifestyle medicine. An amazing organization that has lots and lots of resources. And by the way, so PCRM, we have a ton of resources. You go to PCRM.org. We have patient handouts. We have a ton of resources for clinicians. But the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, I think they have a podiatry interest group there. So a great organization. They have a great conference every year. When I first started going to the American College of Lifestyle Medicine meetings in 2014, about 10 years, maybe 300 people. Now they sell out their conferences, thousands of people, on and on. So
yeah, Wayne said it's 10,000 members.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right.
And that's significant amount of growth.
Right. That's right.
What are your thoughts on lectins in regard to gut health?
So I think that Gundy's book, Plant Paradox, has been a disservice to the medical community. I practice evidence-based medicine. So things like phytates and lecithins have been shown to have somewhat are called anti-nutrient properties. So they impair the ability to absorb certain nutrients. However, and in fact, legumes, for example, do have a fair amount of lecithin. But when you cook legumes, the lecithin, it gets rid of most of them. And so, when was the last time you ate a dried black bean? You can't do it. You break your teeth, right? So, and even more importantly, if you're familiar with the concept of the blues, so National Geographic and Dan Buettner went around the world and identified 5 societies who have exceptional longevity, right? So Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, Icara, Sardinia in Italy, Okinawa, and then Loma Linda, California. So the reason is Loma Linda, California is so if you do a Venn diagram, what they have in common, plant predominant diets, legumes, which are high in lectins, primary source of protein, physical active, they don't smoke, they have strong family connections and a spiritual practice. So you might ask, well, why would Loma Linda, California be in that group? Well, it turns out Loma Linda, California has the highest population per capita of Seventh-day Adventists, and they're plant-based. Majority of them are plant-based because of part of their religion practice. They also physical activity is part of their religious practice as well. And they don't, again, they don't smoke. Right? So again, it's lifestyle medicine.
Just naturally.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Do we have any other questions for Dr. Loomis? We have actually, I think one of your, so Chuck Carroll is on next with his personal experience. And from what I hear, that's pretty incredible.
It is incredible. And, I may have mentioned you, Chuck is helping me with an interesting project, and I encourage everyone to check out. It's a new YouTube channel we're launching here in the next month or so called The Doc and Chef, and it's marrying nutrition science to your plate of food. And Chuck is our producer, and so I'm working with my friend and colleague Karen Dugan, who runs the Center for Plant-Based Living. That's a great resource as well. She offers online cooking classes, and we actually, they're all plant-based, oil-free. We actually have physicians who are prescribing her cooking classes in lieu of metformin for type 2 diabetes. So check out the Center for Plant-Based Living and the Doc and Chef YouTube channel. We have an Instagram page and a Facebook page, although the videos, the first video, we're about 4 to 6 weeks out from publishing those. And Chuck's our producer. So
that's awesome. We were talking about, bringing some of this education as well, creating some live events around that.
Right.
I think it's, I think when people think, about plant-based nutrition or plant-based, diet, they just think it's, not going to be tasty or, there's all these, there's all these concerns that they bring up. And most of it's out of, I think, fear.
That's right.
Trying it or not, venturing out and seeing.
Right. Well, I think too, part of it is the conflation between vegans and plant-based, because we view vegans, they eat rabbit food and granola and hug trees and that. And so to that point, I think you're right, because what's missing here, there's a crucial piece of information of skill set that's missing here, and it's culinary literacy, right? When the basic culinary skill set of the average person is putting something in the microwave, that does create some barriers. And so by teaching people, and Karen is a trained chef, but what's so beautiful about what she does, it teaches people to use food that you recognize and eat every day, and turning that into something that, to your point, is incredibly tasty. It doesn't take a lot of time, and then I help understand the science of the what and the why, and then marry that to her how.
That's awesome. I'm excited to see it. I'm excited and look forward to working with you some more. And I appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Take care, Dr. Loomis.
All right.
So we're going to move over to